5% of all the people who've ever won an Academy Award for acting have been black people. 13% of those who have won a Nobel Prize for literature have been women authors. And out of all the artists who have ever headlined the Glastonbury Music Festival, just one has been from outside of Western Europe or the US. Now, these are just a handful of examples, but it's clear, I think, that we have a representation issue when it comes to arts and culture. And while some of these figures may or may not surprise you, may even shock you, I can't imagine that I'm telling you anything that you didn't already know. Racism, sexism, other forms of discrimination are well documented, well researched. We know this stuff, yeah? Artists and activists around the world have been working tirelessly to put this high on the agenda. And it's working, right? Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, other movements, they are bringing this high on the agenda so that none of us can ignore it, and we're all forced to reckon with it. So this is good, and it's having an effect on arts and culture institutions as well. Institutions are paying more attention to representation, diversity officers are being hired, inclusion policies are being written, change is happening. It's happening slowly. And this is understandable, right? Because the powers that be, the vested interests are pushing back. Systemic change is slow. We know this. And we must keep pushing. And I think there's one aspect that I'd like to explore a little bit more with you, something that I've been thinking about recently, that might help us to make this meaningful change happen. And that is, indeed, the concept of freedom of speech. Now, I'll talk a little bit about why and how we could reconceptualize this and what it might do for us. But first, what is the concept of freedom of speech? Freedom of speech has a long history. It definitely dates back to the ancient Greeks. The Romans talked about it. This has been a topic for a very long time amongst philosophers. And it was codified as part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights after the Second World War. Now, in the Second World War and the Holocaust obviously shook the world and made everyone rethink the basics of how we live together as humans, right, as human beings. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was an attempt to codify our basics. How do we live together? Fundamentals. So it lists rights such as the right to live, the right to life, the right to be free from torture, the right to be free from slavery. Fundamentals. The right to freedom of speech is one of these. Actually, when you look at the text, Article 19, it talks not about the freedom of speech, which is what we usually refer to this as, but it's worded as the freedom of opinion and expression. And the way that we normally think about this is when we talk about opinion, we normally think about political opinions. And when we think about expression, we think about expression of those political opinions in the public arena, right? And the freedom part is to think about the ability to hold that political opinion and express it publicly without the repercussion of violence. Now, and this makes perfect sense when you think about the fact that this was codified after the Second World War, right? Because who were formulating these rights? These were men, powerful men, politicians, sitting around a big, long table about their political opinions, right? You might be pro-capitalism, you might be pro-communism, you have a political opinion, you have a stage, you can talk to the masses in the newspapers and on the radio, and you have the ability to go to war with each other over your opinions. So in that context, this conceptualization of freedom of speech makes a lot of sense. And it was dubbed universal, right? Universal is a universal human right, and so it applies to all of us, was the thinking. This has had an effect that lasts until today. So recently, last summer, for example, journalist Peter R. de Vries was murdered, and we talked about this, amongst other things, as an attack on the freedom of speech. Now, why is that? He was a journalist holding opinions, sharing them in the public arena on telly, and he was murdered as an effect of that, right? So we saw that as a freedom of speech issue. Now, this is very, very valid, obviously, and we need to keep that. But I think by making that definition universal, by calling it universal, we're missing something, because this reflects a certain subset of experiences and perspectives, and it misses others. And so I'm curious whether we can rethink this concept, taking into consideration more perspectives and more experiences of more diverse people in this world than just the people who were sat at that table in the late 1940s, early 1950s. How might we do that? That's what we'll talk about a little bit. I think there's 4 elements that I'd like to talk about. One is opinion. The other is freedom. Third is ability. And finally, access. Opinion we've talked about, right? I said originally this was conceptualized as political opinions mostly. I think it would be worthwhile to stretch this and to talk not about opinions, but about self-expression. So self-expression comes in many shapes and forms, right? It comes in the way we dress. It comes in the songs we sing, the paintings we paint. And so I'd like to stretch that opinion part of the definition to be self-expression. Second is freedom. Freedom from violent repercussions, right? We've talked about. Violence, in that sense, was talked about and was understood to be, for example, murder, war, a punch to the nose. But what we've learned from anti-racist activists is that violence also comes in many shapes and sizes. Violence can also be a nasty comment or even a funny look. And we've come to understand that violence comes in microdoses as well. And we want to be free from violence, big and small. Feminist activists have taught us to think about not just the freedom from violence, but also the freedom to do whatever the hell we please, right? So this is much more broad than just being free from a punch in the face. It's really free to feel that you have the space to express yourself. Then we have ability. If you have the right to do something, but you don't have the means to enjoy that right, it only gets you halfway. So I think when we think about freedom of speech going forward, we need to think about the means that we all need to express ourselves. So this is time, it's space, it's money sometimes. In the words of Virginia Woolf, we all need a room of one's own to really create our thoughts and put them out there in the world. These means are not distributed equally in the world, very obviously. So when we think about the freedom of speech, we need to think about more than just the right. We need to think about how that right translates into reality. Finally, access. Once you express yourself, once you tell your story, to what extent do you have access to stages where you can amplify that story? This access is unequal. This is where we come back to places such as the festivals, such as the Oscars or the Nobel Prizes. These stages need to open up to more diverse stories so that we can have other perspectives and experiences presented. So we've looked at 4 elements that can help us come up with a new understanding of the freedom of speech. One is the opinion part, which we want to stretch and create a new understanding that involves self-expression. One is the freedom part, right? Not just to be free from violence, but to be free to be yourself and express yourself authentically. Third is the ability part, right? Do you have the means to express yourself? And finally, the access part. Do you get to share a stage? Do you get to share your story? Now, in summary, I think that if we want to get to a place where our arts and culture really encompasses stories that have much more diverse stories, identities, histories, experiences, it will help us to have another close look at the concept of freedom of speech and enrich it so that that becomes a right to the freedom of self-expression. Thank you.